When a democracy starts to slip, it never begins with a headline. It begins with a whisper, one quiet decision, one sudden resignation, one name slipping into a position of power that no one expected. And by the time the country realizes what's happening, the guardrails meant to protect everyone have already started to crack. That's the warning behind Senator Dick Durbin's explosive floor speech, and at the center of it all sits Attorney General Pam Bondi. What he described wasn't just political tension. It was a pattern that echoes one of the darkest chapters in American history, a chapter the country once swore it would never repeat.
Investigation, and ultimately President Nixon resigned. But before he resigned, he instructed his staff to give him background information on his enemies list, the people that he considered to be his political enemies. And the word was out that they were going to be treated harshly by his administration, whether it's Department of Justice or the Internal Revenue Service. Well, we went through that chapter, he resigned, and then Congress came together, Democrats and Republicans, and said, we can never let this happen again. We can't let a president put his finger on somebody and say, that's a political enemy, go prosecute him, try to find him guilty of a crime, make sure they pay a fine, give him bad publicity. We agreed on a bipartisan basis for standards between the White House, the Department of Justice, and Congress when it came to these political decisions that could ultimately result in prosecution. Well, under President Trump, we're back into the Nixon conversation about enemies list, except President Trump's enemies list is longer than anything Richard Nixon ever dreamed of. And that's what we're looking at now. On September 20th, the acting U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Virginia, Eric Seibert, announced his resignation. Acting U.S. Attorney, appointed by Trump, resigned. Mr. Seibert resisted President Trump's demands to bring charges without sufficient evidence against New York Attorney General Letitia James and former FBI Director James Comey. Mr. Seibert, a Republican appointed by Donald Trump just a few weeks ago, stayed true to his oath to the Constitution and his commitment to follow the facts and the law. And for that, he was forced to resign his office. In his place, President Trump installed his personal attorney, an attorney with no experience as a prosecutor, never did it before, to indict James Comey in a politically motivated case considered by career prosecutors in that office too weak to bring charges. This indictment represents the latest step in President Trump's long crusade to weaponize the federal government against his perceived political enemies, a return to the days of Richard Nixon. We remember when the president was initially impeached in the first of his historic 2 impeachments after he attempted to pressure a foreign ally to dig up dirt against Joe Biden and his family. And we remember when President Trump turned a mob of insurrectionists loose on our Capitol, where they violently attempted to prevent the peaceful transfer of power leading to his second impeachment. I will never forget that day as long as I live, January 6th. It has been my honor to serve in this chamber 29 years. I've seen a lot. I'm honored to represent a great state like Illinois, but I will never forget that moment when we were sitting here counting the Electoral College votes as to what the American people had decided on the next president. Vice President Pence was presiding. We were seated in our chairs. I noticed something unusual. Those 2 doors opened, and 4 or 5 people walked in up to the vice president and literally yanked him out of his chair and took him out the door. We knew there was a political demonstration outside, but all of a sudden it turned bad and scary and dangerous. The Capitol Police came in and announced to us, seated in this chamber, stay in your desks. We're going to make this a safe chamber in the Capitol. Don't worry about those people demonstrating outside. They're not going to get close to the chamber. Just stay where you are. We looked at one another and thought, what's next? Well, what was next was 10 minutes later, the same policeman came in and said, leave immediately. Don't take anything with you, just get out of the chamber. It's too dangerous for you to stay here. And we all, Democrats and Republicans, filed out those doors. You know what happened next. The insurrectionists took over this building. It was one of the most embarrassing moments in the history of the United States Capitol building. Imagine, if you will, for a moment, if you heard the news that the House of Commons in Parliament had its door broken down and people raided the chamber. You'd say to yourself, what is going on in England, for goodness sakes? The House of Commons taken over by people in the street? That is exactly what happened here. It had happened on January 6th. And so this president Embarrassed by that moment, maybe, who knows if he's ever embarrassed, decided he would go after the people who prosecuted the insurrectionists, the people who were prosecuted for crimes like beating up policemen. You all came here today and we welcome you to this chamber. The reason you're safe in this building today is a lot of women and men in uniform who are guarding you and me and all of our staff so that we can do the people's business. Those people were under attack by the January 6th insurrectionists. These were not curious tourists who came in here. They ended up beating on these police and 140 of them were seriously injured. If you believe it, in this second administration, the president has gone further than Richard Nixon and what he's done before. His political appointees have fired FBI agents and federal prosecutors who were called on to prosecute the insurrectionists. He has installed loyalists whose chief qualification is their loyalty to him, not their loyalty to the law or the Constitution. We recently learned a top federal prosecutor in Sacramento was fired after she advised the Border Patrol to comply with a court order. Yes, the Trump administration fired a career prosecutor for following a court order. Never in the history of our country has a president so brazenly demanded the baseless prosecution of his rivals, and he doesn't even try to conceal it or hide it. He glories in this constitutional outrage. In a social media post, President Trump issued a command to Attorney General Bondi, and I quote, "They impeached me twice and indicted me 5 times over nothing. Justice must be served now. We can't delay any longer." He's referring to the prosecution of James Comey. Imagine that, a sitting president commanding his attorney general to prosecute state and federal officials who simply tried to uphold the rule of law. That's exactly what this president is doing. What Richard Nixon was stopped from doing, he is doing. Since Watergate, Republican and Democratic presidents alike respect the independence of the Justice Department, recognizing that shielding it from the pull of politics was essential to safeguarding the rule of law. Under President Trump, those constitutional guardrails have been removed, destroyed. I want to be clear, what you're seeing from the Trump White House is not normal. This just isn't some inside the Beltway drama. If the president can turn the Department of Justice and the FBI into his own personal police force to target his political enemies, he can just as easily turn it against ordinary Americans. And the dam is already starting to break. The president sent active duty forces into Los Angeles earlier this year to put down protests of his administration's cruel immigration raids. He threatened to make war on the city of Chicago, which I'm honored to represent, by sending forces into that city as well as Memphis, Tennessee, and has now ordered the military to Portland with authorization to use, quote, full force. Full force in Portland, Oregon. The governor of Oregon, the mayor of Portland said what the president said about being at war and unlivable is just plain wrong, and yet he does it. It's a slippery slope into authoritarianism. Once DOJ and our military have been politicized, there are few guardrails left. So while today it's Letitia James and James Comey who are the targets, tomorrow it could be our fellow citizens who dare to even criticize the policies of the Trump regime. That is the risk we face and the danger that lies ahead in its perilous moment. That's why I've opened an investigation calling for answers from Attorney General Bondi, including making available several Trump-installed loyalists for questioning. The American people deserve to know if the chief law enforcement agency of the United States is following the Constitution or pursuing political revenge. Let me end this. During the Watergate scandal, President Nixon attempted to bend the Department of Justice to his will, to go after his enemies, and conceal his administration's involvement in this unlawful conduct. When President Nixon did this, Democrats and Republicans on a bipartisan basis in Congress sounded the alarm together and defended the rule of law. On a bipartisan basis, we responded to Nixon. Those legislatures.
But here we are, watching it unfold again in real time. Durbin's message wasn't subtle. He pointed back to a moment nearly every student of history knows well, a moment that forced the nation to confront how dangerous unchecked power can become. It wasn't about nostalgia or old news. It was a reminder that democracies fall slowly, quietly, almost politely, until they don't. And by the time the collapse becomes obvious, the damage is already done. When he spoke about the past, it wasn't because he wanted to talk about history. It was because history was beginning to repeat itself, and the warning signs were suddenly too familiar to ignore. that's where Pam Bondi's role becomes impossible to overlook. Because what Durbin laid out wasn't just a policy disagreement. It was a shift in how power is used, who it targets, and who is expected to carry out those orders. He traced the pattern step by step, starting with a resignation that should have raised questions long before it made the news. An acting U.S. attorney, a Republican, appointed under the very administration now pressuring him, walked away rather than sign his name to charges he believed had no foundation. It wasn't a rumor. It wasn't speculation. It was a career law enforcement official stepping down because something felt wrong. And in the space he left behind, a new figure stepped in, Pam Bondi. An attorney, yes. A political loyalist, absolutely. But someone whose background didn't include the years of prosecutorial experience usually expected for a role with this much weight. According to Durbin, that wasn't an oversight, it was the point. Because what he described next wasn't normal, wasn't standard, and wasn't something any country should accept from the people who hold its laws in their hands. He said that prosecutors were being pushed out, one by one. Not because they broke rules. Not because they failed to do their jobs. But because they refused to bring cases that had no evidence behind them. And when those prosecutors refused, someone else was installed. Someone more loyal. Someone more willing. Someone like Bondi. That's where the alarm truly begins to ring. Because when a justice system starts rewarding loyalty to a leader over loyalty to the law, it stops being a justice system at all. It becomes something far darker, a tool, a weapon, a channel for revenge, pressure, or political punishment. That's the danger Durbin laid out in painful detail. And it wasn't theoretical. He named specific targets, the kind of targets who once stood up to presidential pressure, who once insisted on independence, who once pushed back. People like Letitia James. People like James Comey. Whether viewers personally admire them or not isn't the point. The point is that law enforcement isn't supposed to bend toward whoever holds power in the moment. It's supposed to remain upright, untouched, and unshakable. Durbin says that line has now been crossed. But he didn't stop there. Because to understand the danger, he said you have to remember another day, one that unfolded inside the very chamber he was speaking from. A day that started as a routine constitutional process and ended as something far more dangerous. He described it not as a political talking point, but as a memory burned into his mind. He spoke about sitting in his chair as the noise outside grew louder. He spoke about watching the doors open as security rushed the vice president away without a word. He spoke about being told to stay calm, to remain seated, to trust that everything was under control, until the officers returned minutes later with a completely different message. Leave. Immediately. Now, that day wasn't about politics. It was about the moment a country witnessed what happens when truth collapses and chaos fills the space left behind. And for Durbin, it was a living reminder that democracies don't fall gently. They fall violently. They fall when the people meant to enforce the law become pawns, when loyalty replaces duty, when the lines that once protected everyone are erased in silence. That's the backdrop behind his warnings about Bondi. Because according to him, she isn't just another attorney general. She's a symbol of a system under pressure, bending in ways no justice system should ever bend. He pointed to prosecutors fired simply for following court orders. He pointed to officials replaced after refusing to weaponize their authority. He pointed to career experts pushed aside because loyalty, not expertise, became the new currency of survival. If that sounds extreme, that's exactly the point. Durbin didn't use vague language. He didn't dance around it. He said outright that this behavior crosses lines that once protected the country from sliding into authoritarian territory. And once those lines are crossed, once the justice system becomes political, no one is safe. Not journalists, not judges, not ordinary citizens. Because a system that can be weaponized against political enemies can be weaponized against anyone, that he emphasized that the danger doesn't come in dramatic moments. It comes in the small steps that add up. One prosecutor forced out. One loyalist installed. One case filed not because it's justified, but because it's ordered. One investigation opened not because evidence demands it, but because a powerful figure wants it. That's how democracies erode, not all at once, but piece by piece. And that's why he says his investigation into Bondi matters. It's not personal. It's structural. It's about whether the people in charge of enforcing the law are doing it for the public or for someone else. He says the American people deserve answers about why prosecutors were removed, why politically advantageous cases were pushed forward, and why experienced legal professionals were replaced by individuals whose strongest qualification appears to be loyalty. But perhaps the most haunting moment of his speech came near the end. Not when he recounted history, not when he described the present, but when he looked ahead, when he asked why the warnings that once united both parties now fall on deaf ears. When he asked whether the courage that once protected the nation still exists in the chamber around him. And when he ended with the bluntest question of all, a question aimed directly at the people sitting around him, but one that echoes far beyond the Senate walls: that I ask there anyone left who cares? Because that's what this comes down to. Not party, not ideology, not past political battles. It comes down to whether the guardrails that were built after the country's darkest moments still matter. Whether the rule of law is something leaders are willing to defend when it becomes inconvenient. Whether powerful figures can be held accountable, even when the pressure to stay silent grows overwhelming. Pam Bondi is at the center of this story because she represents the crossroads. She's the hinge point between a justice system that remains independent and one that bends to the will of whoever sits at the top. Durbin's warning wasn't subtle. He said this moment is a code red, a level of danger that demands attention, action, and courage. And he's challenging lawmakers, the public, and anyone watching to understand the stakes. Because if a justice system can be turned into a tool for settling scores, then no one is protected. If prosecutions can be ordered like political favors, then anyone can become a target. And if those in power can punish critics through the law itself, then democracy doesn't survive. It simply becomes a costume, a thin layer over something far more dangerous. So if you're watching this and thinking this story doesn't affect you, think twice. The independence of the justice system is the only thing standing between a free society and an authoritarian one. And once it falls, once loyalty replaces law, once politics decides who gets prosecuted and who doesn't, the consequences don't stay inside Washington. They reach every family, every town, every person with an opinion strong enough to be viewed as inconvenient. If you believe that democracy still matters, if you think the justice system should serve the people and not the powerful, if you understand how fragile freedom becomes when truth is optional, then you can't look away from this moment. Because this isn't just about Bondi. And it's not just about Durbin. It's about the country deciding whether it still has the courage to defend itself. If you want to stay informed as these investigations unfold, and if you believe in protecting the rule of law, make sure to subscribe, hit the like button, and stay with this channel. What happens next matters, and you deserve to know the truth as it happens.